Inizio in italiano, buongiorno a tutti, sia ai presenti che a chi ci vede in streaming per questa settimana dedicata alla Science Diplomacy. Thanks to everybody to attend and also to the students to attend this first session of our Science Diplomacy Week in Padua. We have today morning introduction and the intervention by Pier Bruno Ruffini. Then ExPoSTEAM, why this title? Because for us it's very important the focus on the interplay between experts and politicians on science and technology in one end. In the second end, the team, the idea is to engage students coming from engineering, okay, mathematics, but also social science and the humanities, all different disciplines interested in science diplomacy. This week arrived as a project financed by several research projects, frankly speaking, but one especially, the Print 2017, and for the end of the week, the Print 2022. Because in this week we will have also two workshops specifically dedicated to our research about Italy in Europe since the 1960s, but up to 1990s. And the new PRIN 2022 is on the European Union search for a strategic role, autonomous role in 1990s. For me, it's very important to explain that the two PRIN are linked in the sense that the first 2017 was dedicated specifically to Italy and some case studies of science diplomacy, or better, the use of science and technology in foreign policy. My specific unity was interested in space activities. And the same subject, the same field, space activities, is also in the next PRIN 2022, with a special focus not only on Italy, but on European Union. Then this week we'll finish in San Servolo in Venice, in the island which is the headquarters of Venice International University, a consortium, and the University of Padua is also inside. Why? Because we want to present there this new observatory launched by the University of Padua on space diplomacy, ET. Space diplomacy particularly seen by Italy, and we hope that in November, finally, our website, Space Diplomacy, would be open. You may see the logo Space Diplomacy in my slide. Last but not least, this, frankly speaking, strong, hard week has been possible, first of all, thanks to the work of our administrative and technical personnel in my department, the Department of Political Science. They worked hardly in the last week, and I want to thank them seriously. And we are here in the Department of History of the University of Padua, and frankly speaking, I want also to thank this department to host us, and also the technician personnel to help us in these sessions. Last but not least, I want to quote also the CISAS, the Center of Padua for Aerospace Studies, where I am a member of the steering committee, and their activities are always a stimulus to new research, and this is a real place for the interdisciplinary exchange. This is the third edition of Science Diplomacy ExPoSTEAM, launched 2 years ago thanks to a very important financement by the Italian Research Ministry, by me and by Marilena Gala, a colleague from the University of Rome 3. We are historians of international relations, but we teach in political science department, and for this reason we are interested to stay in touch and to organize a link, to create a link between history and present time. For this reason, from the beginning, we wanted to engage colleagues, witness coming also from the present time, not only about history. Thanks to this school, we opened the first edition of this international school in Erice, in the center Ettore Majorana, created by Antonino Zichichi in Sicily in 1962-1963, with the mission to bring together beyond the Iron Curtain scientists from East and West to speak about, at the time, the global challenges. For this reason, it's very nice, very important that we were able to open this school in cooperation with Pascal Griset, de l'Université Paris-Sorbonne, the CASD, the Italian Center for High Defense Studies, the CNR, and the Venice International University, which is our starting point. The interplay between experts and politicians. You have here Sally Zuckerman. Sally Zuckerman is the most famous science advisor. In 1960s, he was the advisor of the British governments. And in front of him, he had the British ministers, and this is their position. They have no time. No, they didn't arrive to understand science and technology, but for Sally, the problem is that they didn't have time. They don't put time in searching to analyze and to understand science and technology. This is the problem also today. The relationship between scientists and the decision makers. This is very important to understand how several times we have no linkage between political decisions and the reality of science. We produced this book with Christine Bounot, a colleague from the University of Bordeaux, about this interplay, and also by engaging the public opinion side. Because sometimes it's very important also the side of science communication. Then ExPoSTEAM Diplomacy School or weeks want starting with the witness. In this week, we will have some witness of our recent past. And this was the opportunity to launch an agreement with the Historical Archives of the European Union in Florence for opening a new series of oral history on techno-science and space diplomacy. This is very important because sometimes documents of archives, they are very important, but they didn't arrive to explain all elements, all dynamics. And the witness may give us a real help to try to understand which were this is dynamics. And this is for us very, very relevant. We must to share this research, this memory, the history, the practice with students like you, or better with practitioners, as we made in Erice. This point is very important because we want that these weeks, schools, may be an opportunity, starting from the Italian context, but with an international framework. They must be the opportunity for a sort of intergenerational exchange, an exchange between students, PhD students, but also practitioners. And one of the targets is to arrive to share, to extend also the science diplomacy communication. The concept, but also the practice, the existence, and the role, the relevant role of science diplomacy. It's not easy to share this, but we must to organize, and we must to try to share this knowledge. For me, it's important started with history. I will suggest some example coming above all from space, but not only. The first one is in 1961 during the COSPAR conference in Florence in April. In a very nice dinner on a tagliatelle dish with some Americans, Luigi Broglio presented his project about an Italian satellite, the future San Marco, launched in December 1964. The American delegation was convinced, and with this support, Luigi Broglio came to Amintore Fanfani and then the Italian government. Amintore Fanfani, the chief of Italian government, organized at the end of August 1961 this meeting with the most relevant minister like Tavani, Andreotti, Colombo, Giorgio Bo, Paolo Emilio Taviani, and Giuseppe Pella, but also with Broglio and the president of CNR, Giovanni Polvani, who controlled the Space Commission. They convinced the Italian government to put money. And this is why? Why? Because they understood that it was possible to try to design a strategy to put Italy in space activities in this new field launched by Sputnik in 1957. And Italy entered by this way in space diplomacy. This was one example. Another example is during the debate in 1965-66 about the technological gap, officially launched by this book by Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, a very famous editor of newspaper and a contact man with the French government, the American Challenge. The book was published in 1967, but the debate started in 1965-68, the idea that Europe was able to overcome this technological gap with the USA, but only thanks to a real techno-industrial policy coordinated at European level. In this year, EEC experience, the experience of the European community is a success, and then they want to use this success for relaunching Europe from a technological point of view. You have here some moments, particularly the idea launched by Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, of a sort of European technological community, when UK government launched the negotiation with the Paris for the future Airbus. But also Amintore Fanfani in 1966, with a letter to their colleagues, who was Foreign Affairs Minister, launched this project of a Marshall Plan for technology. And he speak of this with Harold Wilson in June 1967. Last but not least, Robert Marjolin, the Vice President of European Commission, declared the next technological community. And in fact, in November 1966, we have the first meeting of the research minister, European research minister. But frankly speaking, the technological gap debate started inside OSD in Paris, but launched in 1965 by this letter by Amintore Fanfani. And the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Europe decided to create several working groups about several fields. Italy was represented by a young diplomat, Umberto Vattani, in three working groups. One of these was about electronics and computers, and the Italian representative was Luigi Dadda, the Italian father of computer. This is only to underline that Italy had a special role in this story about the technological gap. Science diplomacy is also a tool for science and technology, and in the middle of 1960s, the most advanced technologies arrived from aerospace, and in this period, Europe discussed about several projects of a new medium plane. One project was this, led by UK, Europlane. But the final project was Airbus. And today, Airbus Industries is one of the most relevant firm of aerospace and defense around the world. This story started in the second half of 1960s. And in 1967, Italy was invited to participate in Airbus project. You have here several personalities at the time engaged in a very special meeting, interministerial meeting. Gilberto Bernabei, in touch with Giulio Andreotti, Franco Bolasco, for instance, Ghio for treasury, Marasco for commerce, etc., etc. With them, there were also representatives from firms in June and October 1967. Fiat with Ranfani, Agusta with his president, Corrado Agusta, for instance. The result was that Italy decided for stay outside the project Airbus. Why? Officially, because France proposed only to reproduce the plane without a participation in developing the plane. This was very, very important. Italy at the time had no experience in producing civil planes, and the Italian government wanted to obtain this experience. But it's not hazardous then that Corrado Agusta voted against this participation. He came back from US, where he signed one of the most relevant contract for his firm, the reproduction of Jonoch helicopter, produced by a firm bought in this period by Boeing. And Boeing in this period launched a competitor of the European project Airbus. For this reason, for Corrado, was impossible to vote in favor of Airbus. I recall that we are in the center of the US acceleration for Vietnam War in the second half of 1960s. For this reason, this helicopter was a great opportunity of money. This is not hazardous. Here we have a sort of firm's diplomacy, firm's maneuver. We have the documents. The US State Department sustained Boeing project and wanted to attack the European competitors. The result was the Italian participation in one of the most successful model, 767 plane. You have here in black in this design of the end of 1970s, the part realized by Italian firms. But thanks to this contract, Italy was able to learn how a plane is constructed and was able at the beginning of 1980s to participate in a Franco-Italian project, the ATR, l'Avion de Transport Régional, who was at the time a successful plane. This is another example. The role of expert, and here we have Gian Pietro Puppi, a physicist, who was engaged in the Italian science policy, particularly for the Italian participation in European Space Project, started with ESDRO, the European Space Research Organization, at the beginning of 1970s. But above all, Puppi was one of the fathers of the European Space Agency in 1975. But, and this is very interesting for us, he was a scientific advisor for the Italian ministers of research, like Pedini. And in this position, he was one of the creators of the Italian Space Plan in 1979, the origins of the Italian Space Agency in 1988. You have here the original document of the Italian Space Plan, where you have a very important very important data, particularly for Italy, which was the problem of Italy, which was the turning point for the Italian space plan. Italy decided to put much more money in national program. At the beginning of 1970s, Italy put about 7% of money in European program. You may see how this number is higher than the money put by the other countries. The idea was to pass to overcome this gap and to put much more money in national programs. This would be to be active in a diplomatic way to organize several bilateral projects and several projects to develop all fields of space activities. They try to design a strategy with only 20 pages of this plan. You have here the growing investment foreseen in space, very important, but a constant investment in several fields. It's very nice to see that some of these fields are also today the fields of the present space activities. For instance, Space Lab was the idea to invest in the space modules, and today Italy has a leading role in this field, but also to spend money in telecommunication. Not only, but also for telerilevamento or for the engine. And Italy was able, with Avio, to become leader in the first medium European missile, Vega. This is very interesting, in my opinion, because this is a proof of a sort of strategy. Then, in this strategy, we have some actors, and in February 1980, Italy, thanks to the activities of some scientists like Giancarlo Setti, the ambassador at the time, a diplomat, Umberto Battani, who was the chief cabinet for the Minister of Research, Vito Scalia, thanks also to Italian scientist Franco Pacini, they convinced Ludwig Voltier, the president of the European Southern Observatory, to accept the conditions for the Italian entry in this international organization, which were, this is condition, the idea that Italy would put money to realize new telescopes. And then Italy achieved a participation in these two very relevant experience for astronomy, international astronomy. This is only one example, but we have other examples. Thanks to a very nice movies by Checco Zalone, Quo Vado, Italian public opinion discovered that Italy had a laboratory at Svalbard, at Ny-Ålesund, with 8 researchers, 7-8 researchers. This laboratory was open in 1996, but Italy had also a very special base, Franco-Italian base, Concordia, in Antarctica. And in March 1981, also when Vattani was chief of cabinet of the research minister, Italy entered in the Antarctic Treaty. 1985, Italy opened its first Antarctic base, Mario Zucchelli. This is our only other example of the Italian science diplomacy, again in the space, in the same time, 1983, Luigi Granelli escorted the European astronauts to the launch of a space lab. And the role of this minister was relevant, also thanks to his archives that we had. Space Lab was a very nice opportunity for Italy. Italy participated with 15.6% of the investment. The prime contractor was a German consortium, Erno, but they arrived to produce Space Lab, the first space laboratory, European space laboratory. And this is also a very nice example in the middle of 1980s, when in EEC, the European Community launched also its own reflection, debate about how it was necessary to launch a European coordinated techno-industrial politics, and this thanks to some action like PREST. You may see here the fields of application, the fields of debate for PREST, but also ESPRIT and FAST has actions. They are very interesting because we are in the middle of 1980s. We are with the new turning point by the single act in 1987 in the common market launched by Jacques Delors Commission. This is to say that also at the European level, this research and science technology policy was relevant, and Italy had a role inside. You have here other example of committee to debate. I have no time today, but this was very, very relevant. We will have an intervention by Alessandro Paccagnella on microelectronics. This period represent the origins of the European electronic success, semiconductor policy success in 1990s. They launch several actions to coordinate, to sustain the development of microelectronics in Europe. It's not hazardous that in 1987 we have the creation of the Franco-Italian firm ST Microelectronics, and the relaunch of this firm also with the participation of some Italian diplomats. And we have some very interesting documents in Andreotti paper on this. Last but not least, we arrived to the previous week in Reykjavik. We participated in this Arctic Circle Assembly. This was with Arctic Frontiers, the most relevant conference, techno, scientific and political conference on the future of Arctic. One of the subjects was science diplomacy, and also Italian government presented a panel. You have here the ambassador, Stefano Nicoletti, who is the moderator of this panel, with the president of CNR, Madam Carrozza. Why this photo, in my opinion, is very nice, and this panel was a very nice example of the Italian willing desire, action to design a strategy on techno-science diplomacy. Because here we have the diplomat, scientist, we have a representative of defense minister, the Rear Admiral, chief of the Italian Hydrographic Institute, for instance. We have also the chief of cabinet of the Italian Ministry for Research and University, Madame Bernini. This is also a symbol, in my opinion, of how it's necessary to study science diplomacy from this focus, the interplay between experts and politicians, and an example of operational history, in the sense that we have a huge of example in Italian foreign policy, in the history of the Italian foreign policy, where we may search the role of scientists, of technicians, of advisors, and suggest some trends for present time. This is, in my opinion, the role of operational history, but with a special condition, and I finish here, by applying a real interdisciplinary approach. Real in which sense? In the sense that, like in this experience started thanks to Alessandro Paccagnella in 2021, the launch of this course for engineer, political science and law students, microelectronics and globalization. The name would be the next academic year, microelectronics and geopolitics. We launch a course starting from different languages, no? From engineering and from history, from political science, to study this experience of science diplomacy. Also from an historical point of view, we need to stay in touch with our colleague, with our scientists. Otherwise, we risk, like in some panels, frankly speaking, that I heard in the Arctic Circle Assembly, to have only one point of view. In my opinion, it's not true that scientists may be diplomats. We need diplomats, scientists, specialists of the evolution of the international context, and all together work to understand, to maintain the debate about science, or better for me, techno-science, diplomacy, the role of science and technology in foreign policy. Otherwise, we risk to have no effect. And today also in front of several global challenges, but like at the time of Antonio Zichichi in 1962-63, also at the time they had several global challenges like us today. The key maybe, or for me, is this real interdisciplinary and international approach, starting from students, PhD students, but also by engaging in this debate the practitioners. Thanks for your attention. I finish. And I didn't give question time because I have several students in this room and they heard some of these slides in my lesson. But I wanted to introduce, and then we will have the time for a little break and then for the debate, Pier Bruno Ruffini, our guest, for the first lesson of this week. Thanks.
Bonjour à tous. Buongiorno tutti. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, David, for inviting me for the second time. I'm very pleased to be here again at this very brilliant, famous university, one of the oldest universities. So I was asked by David Burigana to address this topic. Does science diplomacy keep its promise? But of course, I will first start with the introductory remarks in order to maybe to set or to explain a little bit what sounds diplomacy is. I should emphasize that I agree with you when you, David, many times you spoke about science and technology diplomacy, or you also use the words techno-science diplomacy. You're right in doing so. The fact is that for probably the sake of simplicity, we speak about science diplomacy, but we should understand science and technological diplomacy because it's so difficult to part what relates to scientific advances and what relates to technological achievements. So it's a kind of nexus of kind of whole thing, the name of which is science and technology. So in order to start, yes, the main question of this speech is, does science diplomacy keep its promises? Why such a question? If we look at the way science diplomacy was defined at the beginning relates, dates back to some 15 years ago when this vocabulary started to circulate and became a kind of fashion way of speaking about science and technology in international relations. When the first definitions were put forward, we could read, for instance, this. What is science diplomacy? This is an intentional effort to engage with other countries where the relationship is not good otherwise. So a link which was made between science and technological relationship between countries and the context of the political relationship between those countries. And with the idea that science and technological exchanges could do something in order to alleviate tensions between countries or to improve political relationship between countries. Here is another definition from that time, some 14, 15 years ago. What is science diplomacy? Use and application of science cooperation to help build bridges, very important wording, build bridges, and especially in areas where there might not be other mechanisms for engagement at an official level. Both of those authors, Noy, Reiter, and Turekian, had a scientific background, and those two persons, then they moved to positions at the intersection of science and policy. Both of them were at the time advisor to the Department of State. And they were among the first professionals that wrote about science diplomacy. So what came up at that time in the narrative of science diplomacy was a transformative, optimistic vision, very often related to the so-called universal values of science. The universal values of science, if we have this idea that science is a kind of universal language, going beyond of religious or patriotic or whatever kind of loyalties, if we have this idea of a universal language, why could not scientific exchanges benefit the world order, and be able to transfer these universal values to the political sphere at the international level? This is the optimistic and transformative vision of science diplomacy. Let's have a look, for instance, at this other quote by Paul Berkman, who is one of the strongest advocates of the positive role that science diplomacy can have. Science is a neutral platform that allows for less politically charged dialogue. And again, this idea of creating bridges, etc. So we have the idea that science is probably something relating to political things, but rather distant in a sense from the political debates. And this would give science and scientific exchanges a specific role in international relations. So from then comes the promises, the two promises that science diplomacy may convey. The first one is that scientific cooperation between countries can help alleviate, can help mitigate international political tensions. I'm sorry, I hope you can hear me. My voice is a bit weak today. So we can relate this to the debate about science for peace. Can scientific exchanges enhance peace? This relates to science for diplomacy aspect. I will come to this immediately. And the other promise is that if we manage to have in diplomatic decisions, in political or policy decisions regarding international challenges, global threats on the planet, global threats on humanity, if we manage to have the best possible scientific knowledge, then we give a chance to us for addressing in the best possible ways those global challenges. And this relates to science in diplomacy. So I will try to bring some elements for answering those two questions. And before that, it may be useful maybe to recall the basics of the definition of science diplomacy. We have this very famous 2010 report by the Royal Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is a kind of a canonical, maybe the Bible, let's say, the main grounding of the discourse, dating back to 2010, and making a distinction between three aspects: science in diplomacy, science for diplomacy, and diplomacy for science. You may know already about that, so I will go rapidly through those 3 points. Science in diplomacy means informing foreign policy decisions with scientific advice, what I mentioned just before, trying to have the best use of the knowledge, the available scientific knowledge, in order to try to have the best policy decisions. Diplomacy for science is all what relates to the way the diplomatic structures or diplomatic resources can support, can enhance international scientific cooperation, facilitate international scientific cooperation. This is diplomacy for science. And science for diplomacy, on the other reverse way, is using scientific cooperation in order to improve international relations. This is one of the places where the promise lies. In science for diplomacy, you should understand that science cooperation, international scientific cooperation, may have a diplomatic value. That is, may bring something more than just scientific benefits to countries which team up in order to cooperate for science and technological achievements. But science exchanges, scientific exchanges, can also bring something more in the field of international political relations. I will, of course, go deeper into this. And then we have this second milestone in the literature, which is the 2017 article written by 4 former chief scientist advisors to 4 different governments. Peter Gluckman was the leading author. He was at that time a chief scientist to the government of New Zealand, but with him, the other ones were the chief scientist, former chief scientist to the British government, the former chief scientist to the Department of State, to reckon already quoted, and the last one was the former chief scientist to the government of Japan. So those 4 very prominent professionals introduced a distinction between actions that we can label as sound diplomacy actions, but distinguishing this from the point of views of the interests. The question would be, who benefits sound diplomacy? Whereas the first definition, more precisely, try to answer the question, what is sound diplomacy for? Who benefits sound diplomacy? First answer, states. Of course, at the level, states benefit from sound diplomacy in the sense that sound diplomacy relates to actions which are designed to directly advance a country's national needs, a country's national interests. Then another aspect relates to neighboring countries that have, for instance, to manage issues having also a scientific input, such as, for instance, managing a river basin, actions designed to address cross-border interests, which is relevant in any situation where neighboring countries have to manage a shared resource basin. It could be an oil field or marine gas in the sea that touches to different countries. And third, actions primarily targeted to meet global needs and challenges. Global needs and challenges, we understand climate change, reduction of biodiversity, pandemics, whatever. And of course, actions primarily designed to meet those global challenges relate very directly to what was called in the other definition, the first definition, science in diplomacy. So from then, I would maybe emphasize that we can enter the topic of sound diplomacy from two different sides, from the statist or from the globalist approach. We have those two approaches that come together. We have to take account of both, but depending of people, depending of the interests which are at stake, well, some would favor, some would enter to the topic of sound diplomacy from the statist door or from the globalist door. From the statist approach, the point is to protect and enhance national interest, using science, for instance, in foreign policy, using scientific and technological exchanges to strengthen the national system, the national scientific and technological system, etc. All this directly relates to national interest. We start from the globalist approach, then the point is different. The topic, the goal is to solve global problems. This is a problem-solving approach, which is, of course, very different from the national or the statist approach. The statist approach is very much connected to the traditional diplomacy, that is state-centered diplomacy. Well, whereas the globalist approach is much more based on the scientific discourse, on the science-based discourse. We can understand that science diplomacy is a subset of foreign policy from the statist point of view, whereas on the globalist point of view, the emphasis is put on common interests. The emphasis is put on the governance of those global challenges that no countries can solve by itself, and that need cooperation, that need collective action to be addressed in the best possible way. And lastly, if we want to connect those approaches to, I would say that ideological inspiration, then realism would be the main inspiration of the statist approach, whereas universalism or idealism would inspire the globalist approach. But as I mentioned before, those are the two faces of the same coin. You cannot make that distinction. I'm trying to sort items, to sort different categories or arguments or points to analyze, but the intrication between those two is, of course, to keep in mind every time. So let me turn let me try. I'm sorry what I'm doing that. Okay. Try to answer the first of the two questions. The first question is, can sound diplomacy help ease international tension, international political tension? In fact, we have in the discourse on sound diplomacy, we have very often affirmative statements that sound diplomacy is something good for international political relations. It can mitigate international tensions, and etc. But unfortunately, we do not have much evidence of that. We have many examples in the literature, but empirical evidence is not so frequent. And this is a problem. I mean, as a scholar, as a scientist, we do think in academia that when we study sound diplomacy, we would try to study sound diplomacy with scientific methods. And studying sound diplomacy with scientific methods would recommend to try to find evidence of the statements that are put forward in the name of sound diplomacy. So what I try to do, sorry, I'm going too fast. Right. I try to have a look to different pieces of the literature of the past or of today, and to try to look in different examples where countries were or still are in difficult political relations, to try to understand if scientific exchanges did something or not in order to alleviate political tensions between countries. So those are the articles I could look at first. Let me just put forward several examples. The first one is the first Pugwash Conference, Science and World Affairs. This took place during the Cold War. We had in 1955 the very well-known Einstein-Russell Manifesto, and those two leading scientists, they warned governments at that time about the dangers of the arms race, of the nuclear arms race. This was the Einstein-Russell Manifesto, and in the wake of this very influential statement, 2 years later, the first Pugwash Conference was held in Pugwash, in the western coast of Canada. And the name of this conference was Science and World Affairs. Science and World Affairs, you could consider this a kind of proxy of science diplomacy, although at that time we didn't speak about science diplomacy yet. And since then, this Pugwash movement has been alive and very active. The Pugwash movement is a non-governmental organization which tries to influence policymakers, policy decisioners at the world level in order to limit, to restrict the use or the production, the use of arms and more generally nuclear arms and more generally arms in the world. This movement was granted the Nobel Prize for Peace some 20 years ago. Then we have another example, which is the vaccine diplomacy during the Cold War, which is an example which comes up in the literature on sound diplomacy, saying, look, at the time of, in the 50s, the relationship between the United States and USSR were difficult and non-friendly at all relationships. But since scientific cooperation could take place. And this example is here, vaccine diplomacy. We had this American scientist, Alexander Sabin. He was working in the United States, and he invented the oral vaccine against poliomyelitis. But he was not able, for different reasons, to test this vaccine in the United States. And he could arrange a cooperation, an agreement with the Soviets, and he could achieve the testing phase of this oral vaccine in the USSR. Millions of persons were vaccinated successfully, and this was very rather successful agreement, scientific agreement between those two countries at a time where those countries were not at all in good relationship. Some 20 years later, in the middle of the 70s of the last century, we were in the phase of the détente between USSR and the West. And that was the time where this Apollo-Soyuz test project was achieved. And this is another example which comes very often when you read what is written about science diplomacy and the way science diplomacy can do something good for international relations. Such articles or discourses put forward this example where an American vessel was launched and a Soviet vessel was launched, and those two vessels could join in the space. And the very famous shake hand between the two chiefs of the missions of the Soviet and the American missions could be done, and could be something quite useful in illustrating, in showcasing, in a sense, the process of the détente. Then we had also in the 70s of the last century the restart of relationship between the United States and China. They didn't have any diplomatic relations since the creation of the Popular Republic of China. And when Richard Nixon made his first official trip to China and could sign this very famous Shanghai communique, scientific exchanges were a part of the global agreement that was passed at that time between those two leaders. And the scientific agreement by itself was signed 5 years later, and the diplomatic relationship were built officially 7 years later. Then in the present time, we have this, the relationship between the US and Cuba is also interesting to mention because as you know, since 1960, since the Cuban Revolution, the relationship between Cuba and the United States have been rather difficult relationships, but a kind of warming up of relations came up, especially when Obama took office in the United States. And also we have in the literature, we have many evidence of scientific cooperation being something that could accompany the warming up of political relations. We have also in the literature interesting things about relationship between some Western countries and North Korea, especially in the field of what is called volcano diplomacy, with British scientists having set up many years ago a fruitful cooperation with North Korean counterparts in the context that you know that North Korea has tense relations with almost all of the Western countries. And lastly, I would also mention the Sesame experience, which is quite interesting. Sesame is the acronym for this synchrotron light for experimental science and applications in the Middle East. This is a research infrastructure dedicated to fundamental physics, which was built in the Middle East, in Jordan, which started to work in 2017, and which is often mentioned in the literature about science diplomacy, because if you look at the stakeholders of this research infrastructure, it is there is very significant things to look at. You have in this on the, I'll say that, yes, the list of those main stakeholders, founders, that states that funded and are founding members of this international organization. You'll find Israel, but also the Authority of Palestine. You'll find Jordan, you will find Turkey, you will find Iran, you will find Pakistan, you'll find Egypt, and you have also associated members outside this area, among them the European Union. And this multinational research infrastructure, which is a synchrotron, can this synchrotron help bring peace in the Middle East? Due to the way this structure was built, from contributions of countries which have been for long opposing themselves in this area, of course, we cannot avoid trying to relate the success, the scientific success, the diplomatic success of building such an infrastructure to the political environment. And this is why Sesame is also very often quoted as a good example of scientific exchanges, scientific cooperations as channels for peace. So we have to try to discuss briefly all these examples. So the first question would be, why do countries in political opposition cooperate? Why do they want to cooperate on the grounds of science and technology? Of course, the first answer is rather obvious, an obvious one. They have an interest in doing so. They have an interest, and this is the reason why they agree for cooperating, in spite of their political disagreements. The polio vaccine trials, we had an interest on both sides. The American scientist was looking for a testing area. The USSR, the Soviet Union at that time, was very eager to try to fight the polio in its population. So both interests could mix in this project. We have also reasons explaining why the Soviets accepted to join the Apollo-Soyuz test. They could learn what they were not able to do. Surprisingly, the space sector in the Soviet Union was very strong at that time, but surprisingly, they were missing knowledge or proficiency for docking mechanisms, and they could learn from that. USA-China restart of relationship in the 70s of the last century. There was also a need on the Chinese side to rebuild the research system, the university system after the cultural revolutions. But of course, political motivations were present. They were present on both sides, on the side of the United States, on the side of Western countries. And if I want to sum up the idea was probably that both countries on each side, countries in each of those situations, could understand how interesting it was to keep some channels of communications between countries and science and scientific exchanges, for the reason already mentioned that they are more distant from immediate political things than other aspects or other segments of the society. Scientific exchanges were a very good candidate to try to keep relationship, even in context where political relationship were not good. There was also on the countries participating in such experiences, a wish to express their goodwill, express their good mood, or try to showcase in a way cooperation. And that was the case during the Cold War, relationship between the USA and the Soviet Union, or between USA and China. And showcase cooperation is also very present in the Sesame project in the Middle East. This is a way of trying to push forward the idea that in this area, which is a very troubled area, well, scientists, wherever they come from, wherever they are, they can cooperate in this area, in this region. What we learned from those examples also is that international scientific cooperation is very sensitive to the quality of the political relationship. And this is rather interesting to look at. In all of those situations, obviously, cooperation between countries which are in difficult political relations could not be achieved without a formal agreement of both countries. The political side switches the green light for this. Look, for instance, at this Apollo-Soyuz project. This Apollo-Soyuz test project was prepared during 5 years before it was achieved. Of course, on both sides, both governments agreed for that, agreed for their engineers, technicians, scientists, communicate, exchange in order to prepare these tests. So there is a political impulse at any time. And this probably leads me to stress that, how to say that, the presence of scientific exchanges or the intensifications or strengthening of scientific exchanges between countries is more a consequence than a cause of the improvement of the political relations. It seems to me, when we are looking at those examples, that there is a political will that allows for exchanges to take place. And then after, this can enhance, strengthen the better stance of the political relations between those two countries. For instance, science was named by one of the authors that I could read, was named a barometer of détente. I like this expression, a barometer of détente. That not a cause, Apollo-Soyuz was not something that could favor the détente. Apollo-Soyuz was something that was a witness of the détente, was an expression of the détente. And if we look at the USA-Cuba scientific exchanges during the last 40 years, we have a quite interesting article which tried to correlate on the upper side the percentage of US authors in Cuban scientific publications. So Cuban scientific publications having a co-authorship with an American, at least American scientist. And on the lower side of the slide, the number of foreign countries which with Cuban scientists collaborate. This taken from data on international scientific publications. And the authors of this article, they try to correlate those two series with different events. Those events were, for instance, the first agreement between the botanical gardens in the United States and the Academy of Sciences in Cuba, or the first visit of the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, to the Academy of Sciences of Cuba. And lastly, on the right side of both is 2015, the Obama visit to Cuba. And so you have this kind of correlation of the increase of scientific cooperation with the United States and with the rest of the world, moving alongside with positive steps in the improvement of the political relations. So to finish with this, it seems to me that we can distinguish between three types of situations, which I call scenarios. The first scenario would be this: international scientific cooperation has no influence on international tensions and conflicts. So it seems to me that, unfortunately, Sesame must fall in this category. Just have a look at what is going on in the Middle East these days. Nobody can defend or sustain the idea that scientific cooperation have some kind of influence on the political situation in this area. The same is true for the North Korean West relationships. Then we have a second category, scenario number two, scientific cooperation as part of the warming of political diplomatic ties. Those are the situations of the 60s, of the détente period between USA and USSR, USA and USSR, and USA and China, or in the present century relationship between Cuba and the United States. Scientific cooperation accompanies the movement of the warming up of political relations. And in such situations, very interestingly, we can see the article which I quoted, the document, the role of scientists as precursors, as persons that were very useful to initiate contacts and in a way to pave the way for diplomatic agreements some months or years later. And again, this comes from what I already mentioned, that scientific exchanges are a good place for trying to have this role, because they are, as already mentioned, more distant than other spheres of the social life, of the political stakes. And the last scenario is this one. It's quite interesting. My view from what I could read in those articles is that scientists are the most influential persons on the stance of policy making, of political decisions, when they stop to be scientists and they start to be something more than just scientists, when they start to play a diplomatic role. And this is evidence with the Pugwash movement. I could pick up this quote: scientists are not a good substitute for diplomats. Professor Burigana mentioned that before. We have scientists who are diplomats. We are trying to find ways to have them work together. And it seems to me that when scientists are most influential, this is not just when they are doing scientific cooperation with counterparts in other countries, but this is when they step out of this scientific sphere to go forward toward a more diplomatic role. This is what is called track 2 diplomacy. Track 2 diplomacy, or informal or parallel diplomacy, where scientists engage in dialogue with the aim of confidence building. I gave here some examples, and I could again quote the role of the Pugwash conferences, the Pugwash movement, in trying to shape the way decisions are made regarding armament and disarmament. Conclusion at that side, international politics influences international scientific cooperation much more than the reverse, than international cooperation influence international politics. Maybe it's a bit disappointing, maybe too critical about an official narrative on science diplomacy, but well, this one I could feel when reading all the articles. But nevertheless, keeping channels of dialogue is of utmost importance between opposing countries. And this is a real added values of scientific exchanges, keeping those channels present. Maybe doors are closed, but doors are not locked. And through scientific exchanges, doors between countries having difficult relations are not locked. I don't know if I have time enough to address the last question.
Yes.
Yes, I have time enough. Okay, so my last question is, can science diplomacy help tackle global issues? Remember, this is the other side of the promise. The promise of science diplomacy is twofold: try to mitigate tensions between countries, one thing, and second promise, try to have the best scientific input in order to have the best international diplomatic decisions. So this relates to the globalist approach of science diplomacy, which I already mentioned. This relates to the science in diplomacy aspect. And we have a look at science and technology intensive global challenges. And also we may think about spaces which are beyond national jurisdictions. I can mention what the literature considers as two success stories. And in that sense, science diplomacy was in both those situations very effective. The first is the Montreal Protocol on substance that deplete the ozone layer, which was agreed between countries by the international community in 1987. Quite interesting to see that the leading person was an ambassador, Richard Benedict. He wrote a book, Ozone Diplomacy. He was, in a way, the architect of this international agreement. And today, we consider that this ozone layer issue is properly addressed by the international community. So this is a usual situation. The scientists were the whistleblowers. They warned, they put forward the danger. The scientific message was this: we are using substances in our daily life. The way our economies are working produces substances that deplete, that harm the ozone layer. So the scientists, they put the topic on the table. And then the diplomatic community could take over this question and be able to reach a multilateral agreement, which is correctly implemented and controlled every year, etc. Then the governance of Antarctica is also very often listed as a success of science diplomacy. Why? The Antarctica is a space, a territory beyond national jurisdiction. It doesn't belong to any country. And it could be agreed with the Antarctic Treaty in Washington in 1959, then with the Protocol of 1981 in Madrid. It could be agreed that this place would remain entirely dedicated to scientific activity. There is a moratorium of 50 years that will end up after 50 years. So we'll see then what comes again. But this is an example which is often mentioned as a success of science diplomacy. The scientific community, the international scientific community could have its voice heard by the diplomatic community in order to set a governance of this territory, which respects the interests of the territory, which protects the territory from any kind of national ambition, of national territorial ambitions, and which aims at keeping this territory to scientific activities only. But now there is a but. If we look, I would like to quote here Peter Gluckman. Peter Gluckman, I already mentioned this name. He's now the president of the International Science Council. The International Science Council is a very important non-governmental organization which gathers many dozens of scientific institutions, academies, networks of scientific institutions, etc., and which introduces itself as the global voice of science. So at the international level, we have this institution, the International Science Council, which embodies, in a way, the scientific voice, the voice of science. And what did he write last year? We need to be honest. Progress on the sustainable development goals have been disappointing. There is a gap between words and action. There is a gap between technical risk assessments of different challenges is what the scientific community puts on the table. A gap between those technical risk assessments and how policymakers and politicians react. Of course, we have on the negative side of the balance sheet, on the minus side of the balance sheet, the COVID-19 at the time, we had expressions like COVID-19 was a failure of science diplomacy. Because what happened, you remember what happened probably. What happened was that the response of the scientific community was rather quick to come, and scientists could team up, could share knowledge about the pandemics. The industry very quickly came in the play, and the first vaccine came up a little bit more than 1 year and a half after the starting of the pandemics, which was very successful thing. So on the scientific and industrial side, the response was positive. But on the contrary, on the diplomatic side, the situation of the COVID-19 was not that successful. We had the failure of multilateral diplomacy at that time. And you can see that from the fact that by the end of 2021, that is almost 2 years after the starting of the pandemics, only 6% in the poorest of 50 or so countries of the world, only 6% of the population had been vaccinated. So the failure of the multilateral diplomacy lied in the fact that the dissemination of vaccines at the global level was not very effectively achieved. If we look at climate, we have mixed results. If we look at the, sorry, climate. You may have known about the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body of collective expertise which was founded under the auspices of the United Nations in 1988, and which is really the strongest way by which the scientific community can put on the table of the diplomats the state of the art regarding the climate science. Then we have the Conference of Parties, which take place every year under the Climate Convention. And we may contrast the Conference of Copenhagen in 2009 and the Conference of Paris 5 years later. The 2009 conference was considered a failure, very limited engagement by countries, no way to find an agreement between them. And contrary to that, 5 years later in Paris, the Conference of Parties was considered a reasonable success. Compared to the first conference I mentioned here, countries accepted to commit themselves much more in order to take actions against the climate warming. Could we say that the scientific advice was not good in Copenhagen, and then the scientific advice was efficient 5 years later, 6 years later? Not exactly. The success or the failing depends on two things. I imagine that first, of course, the quality of the scientific advice is very important. Second, the way the scientific advice transfers to the diplomatic community, that is, the scientific advice mechanism, is also something very important in order to have the best working of the science in diplomacy process. But last and not least, the political will for reaching an agreement in the end is what is the most important. In Copenhagen, there was no failure of the scientific advice. There was a failure of the political will. In Paris, the context had changed. Countries were more ready to move forward together and to commit themselves more. So I would say, in order to finish, that probably from this very quick overview of science in diplomacy and science diplomacy in the frame of global challenges, the barriers to achieve climate goals, those barriers are more political than technical. Scientists are able to say what are the technical solutions. But if it doesn't work, if science diplomacy doesn't work, or if science diplomacy doesn't work enough in such context, probably this comes most often from obstacles on the side of diplomacy than obstacles on the side of scientific knowledge. And then to conclude, what I would recommend is this. truly, when we consider the expression science diplomacy, what is crucial is the word diplomacy. We have to understand that in the end, science diplomacy is diplomacy. And diplomacy has the final word. And practical recommendation, I would recommend you, students, to learn as much as possible what relates to diplomacy, international politics, international law, international organization, etc. Merci.
I think we have the time for some question, and then we have the break for the lunch, and we will start in the afternoon. If you have some questions or remarks. Okay. May you came here, it's better.
So I like the definition of the barometer as well. I was going to ask or like give a suggestion about calling it a thermometer, but I think that pressure is better to define the political, like the diplomatical ties. So I appreciated the definition that you picked. And yeah, for me, what it seems the most interesting aspect that has been underlined a bit, but not enough, I think, is the fact that the science diplomacy and scientific cooperation can be used to trace diplomatical ties, and most importantly, which has not been underlined, I think that what's interesting and can be useful for the study of diplomatical ties historically, it can be more what has not like what countries doesn't allow to do to scientific scientific researchers. So what can a country doesn't allow? Interesting, because it shows what are the interests that cannot be touched of a certain countries, and what maybe comes from a view of the state and of how people interact with each other, different than the one that you might have. But I think that the state, it's more like a barrier between people and exchanging economical interest or scientific interest. So historically, I think it's more accurate to see what the countries have erased from the scientific share of technologies more than what they allow to do. Because what they allow to do, I don't think is only based on interest. It's just that if you don't have any interest, you allow it, because is something that it takes an effort to erase, or like to don't share certain technologies. So in certain cases, it's easier to allow a scientific cooperation because you have nothing to worry about, so you allow it. And if you don't allow it, that's the part where you should care more about studying why it didn't happen, or why it was not even in a discussion to have a certain scientific operation. Like obviously military technology are state interest, and we're used to it, so we already know that many countries doesn't allow that. But there are other aspect, scientific fields where countries doesn't allow cooperation between, and not only that, but more on the like a specific specifically in the agreements that certain countries can have between each other in the scientific part. What a scientist that goes to the other country, or what the scientists between each other are allowed to share, and what they are not allowed. So not only what fields are in cooperation between the countries, but also what in the scientific agreements that they have, scientists are allowed to do or not. Because now we already know that China, in their scientific cooperation, the scientists are not allowed to do certain things. And so that's what can be useful to have evidence of certain countries have certain interest of in the cooperation in between countries that are democratic or not. The interest of a not democratic country is to keep the regime, and to allow it, they need to force people not to share too many ideas with the others, because certain ideas are not allowed in the countries. And so what can be interesting is that. Then I had another question or like suggestion. Yeah, scientific cooperation can be like as an impact in diplomacy. It can be not only a barometer or thermometer of international relations, but an accelerator or slow down the relationship between countries. More for sure, more an accelerator, because as you shared. If you start to have again, I don't know, United States with Russia, you start to have again diplomatic ties, you can accelerate these diplomatic ties, allowing more scientific cooperation, or use those new scientific cooperation to like using the propaganda to show that these ties are getting stronger. So I think that science diplomacy in the like as a use for an international relations student that studies international relationship between countries, can use scientific diplomacy and diplomatic scientific ties in these two aspects to see what is not allowed, to check on the relationship, and how can the science diplomacy accelerate the process of bonding between two countries. And another thing that I want to add, and I'll stop. While you were giving your speech, I started to think about the Magellan, or like all their exploration of European to New World and other continents, and they used to show their scientific knowledge to other civilizations, to not for a need, like for a special need or special interest, but just to show power. And so I think that diplomacy and scientific diplomacy can be useful for certain countries to show their power, and to like as a I forgot the English name for that, but show powers and I think it's just something that it's not only an interest, but it's just human to, like, when you're in a good position, you tend to show that you are, and because I think it's just human nature to do that. But so another thing that I wanted to add is that like as the European did in that time of the exploration, they show up their technological advancements compared to their is to passively threat the other countries. So it can be something that that can still happen. It's just to find how it's done, I think. Marco Tronfi.
Try to make brief answers, starting from your last point. Yes, of course, there are situations where science diplomacy is activated by some countries to show their power. One aspect of science diplomacy, one driving force of science diplomacy at the national level, is to project influence. Okay, to project influence, and scientific achievements. Only strong, scientifically speaking, countries can do that, can be able to be influential, because they are strong scientifically. They try to showcase their scientific achievements. They use science in what is called the nation branding. Okay. So that's you're right. Then moving back to the second point, barometer or accelerator, or this is exactly the point. What I try to sketch out very simply is there may be correlations between the political stance of a bilateral relation between two countries and the stance of scientific exchanges between those two countries. But we lack evidence. We lack scientific evidence in order to confirm whether scientific exchanges are just a barometer of political changes, and this is most often the situation. It seems to me that again I repeat what's one of my conclusions, but you cannot have an intensification of scientific exchanges if the countries do not allow that. And it seems to see that those scientific exchanges are not that much influential on the stance of the political relation. They are more on the side of the consequence than a causal factor. And then moving back to your first question, which is the most important of the three, maybe I didn't touch that because we do not have time enough for all this, but your question is the trade-off between openness and security. And maybe you have in mind what our colleague John Krieger very often explains. There are scientific knowledge that are allowed to circulate, and there are scientific knowledges which are not allowed to circulate. And why aren't they allowed to circulate? Because of state reasons, because of security reasons, because of the government interest. When they touch to the military, when they touch to some economic interests, etc. So we have this trade-off to manage between the interest of science as such, which is to have the broadest circulation of knowledge, no barriers, no obstacles, and the interests of states, which are to limit, to restrict the circulation of certain knowledge. And by the way, we are in a period now where the cursor is moving more towards the security side than the openness side of science, especially, you mentioned that, especially in the relationship with the so-called non-like-minded countries, authoritarian regime, and so on. So this is an important point, but I guess that our colleague, Professor Bertelsen, probably will touch that later on.
Yes. And then
about the scientific, the evidence, could you please remind me of what you said about
the scientific evidence?
We don't have scientific evidence for what? Sorry.
I think it's hard to bring scientific evidence when we want to correlate.
Okay, now, okay.
The stance of international scientific exchanges between two countries and the ups and downs of the political relations between those two countries.
Because what I thought about is, again, to use the opposite point of view in a way. If a country doesn't allow it, or if a country, it's try to be in the part of the security, it means that, not necessarily, but I think strongly, it may mean that this thing can be possible. So, for example, scientific knowledge can share democracy values. Yes, it does, probably. Why? Because authoritarian countries doesn't allow certain behaviors. So if a country see that the possibility that it can happen strong enough, like in a strong enough way, it tries not to let it happen. So the evidence can be found not in the countries that sharing each other, because of course there can be many causes. So like scientific exchange can bring democracy to a certain country or can bring a better development of relations. We cannot know, but we know that if certain countries doesn't want to have democracy values or a better situation with the other country, like try to keep international scientific programs to each other, but not to have a better situation than the one that they have diplomatically, so like to stay in a gray area between be enemies and friends. They make scientific cooperations in a certain way to not allow certain effects. So we can see that the effects can be possibly done because they don't want it to be done. Like they don't want to reach that point. So the evidence can be found in the opposite way in that aspect, in the fact that you don't want it, so the effect might be possible because you don't want it, so you're doing something positively, so you can read maybe in the instruction to the scientist, for example. I'm making this up, but probably it's possible that the scientific scientist that was going to the United States has certain rules to follow. Those rules to follow are a statement from a certain country that if the thing that I'm not allowing to do would be done, it would have a certain effects that, like, we have an evidence in that aspect. No, I don't know if you agree with me, but maybe it can be an approach, at least better than nothing, for sure.
What I understand from your point is that the values that are conveyed by international scientific cooperation, values of openness, of equity, of transparency, those values may contradict the interest of some countries in some points, and some countries may be reluctant to engage in scientific cooperation with other countries because they would fear that those values would transfer to maybe other parts of the society. This is an important point because, as you may know, for instance, the European Union, European Commission, for instance, which puts a lot of emphasis on the European values, tries to use the scientific exchanges and scientific agreements with countries outside of Europe, tries to use those agreements in order to not only to protect, but also to project European values abroad.
Like, the evidence is stronger when you try to resist that instead of...
To what? To
resist that instead of allowing it. Like, I'm trying to share my democratic values. They might have an effect or not, we don't know, but I'm trying to share it. But if you're trying to resist to it, I think it's a stronger evidence than allowing it. I don't know if it makes sense for you, but for me, like, it does, because you're recognizing also the effect. Recognize the effect is stronger than trying to pursue that effect. Because you recognize it and then you resist it. Because if a state try to be stronger and show its power, you don't know if like, it's hard maybe to, because in this field it's hard to recognize the effects. But if you see a country that makes an active effort on resisting to those effects, you are basically stating that you also agree on that, and that you're taking action because you're seeing the good enough evidence that this effect might happen. I don't know. The resistance to me is much a stronger way to...
Do you have an example?
No, but for sure from the example, like, it should be a point of research probably to make it to, of course, prove it. It's an hypothesis with no basis for now, but like from the theoretical aspect, to me has a value, and maybe it can be a way to open a road to find a empirical or at least stronger empirical evidence on this aspect. And not in a quantitative way, but in a qualitative way. You have to search for the scientific collaboration that they have and what was allowed the scientists to do or not to do. And you see, maybe if maybe have we can take an example of Russia and the United States. You see the years, because you already know that the tensions historically they become higher and lower. So in the highest point, you search for a scientific collaboration. You see what the scientist was allowed to do. You go 20 years later in a better environment for the two countries, and you see what the scientist was allowed to do. Maybe certain boundaries are not there anymore. So I think it can be a research that can be done. It can be useful for the development of the empirical evidence.
There are many unanswered questions on the research agenda, and your question is about the methodology mostly. Are you working on that, or have you an interest?
I don't think it's good enough for a master thesis. It's maybe a much higher level of the research. It takes a bit of time to do that.
Okay, we have Helen now. If you have questions or remarks, please use the microphone.
Okay, hi. This is
Ellen.
really weird length. I'm Ellen Gibbs, and I'm a master's student under the advisement of Professor Bergana. So your scenarios 1 through 3, I liked those as a way to break down the discourse around science diplomacy. And the first one where you said there's no place, or like it's not effective at all, this kind of perspective. So there's an article that I read recently by Runges and Flink, like
What?
romancing science diplomacy for global something.
Romancing.
It's a very critical, harsh. I don't know how to say the author's names, but that made me think about your scenarios and what is the point, or what is the place for all of those perspectives in the discourse on science diplomacy? Are they all important? Do the various perspectives serve a purpose in terms of studying it?
Well, maybe I didn't understand quite well your point, but you are quoting this article, Romancing Science Diplomacy.
That reminded me of your first scenario where it's saying there's no place or purpose, or it cannot be effective.
Yes, what I tried to do was to look to some pieces of the literature on different case study.
Yeah.
Just a rather quick look on such articles, and my conclusion is not 100% negative. It's
no, that's not what
I
I
try to sort out different situations, and indeed, I could identify a first category of situations where scientific exchanges do not have any kind of influence on the political climate or on the political relationship between countries.
Right, but I didn't take your analysis as purely negative. What I wonder is there a benefit from all of those 3 perspectives on the discourse of science diplomacy? Do we need all of those different perspectives?
Yes.
What do we get from each of them, I guess?
I think that the takeaway is that when we try to discuss the effectiveness of science diplomacy, which is the topic, does it work or not? Does it fulfill the promise or not? We have to consider the context at any time. We cannot have any sort of general conclusion. It works, it doesn't work. Maybe I'm critical against the mainstream discourse, which tried to convey the idea that it should be beneficial anywhere, anyway. No, it depends. We have to look on a case-by-case basis, you see. And I think it's helpful for the science diplomacy discourse to understand when it works, why it works, when it doesn't work, and why it doesn't work or has not worked. It's a good service to bring, I think, not to be, how to say that, too easily optimistic, or you see. Okay. So we need historians, we need case studies, and I think each case study could bring a kind of conclusion, but case studies are different, and conclusions may be different depending on the context.
Okay, thank you.
No, it's very interesting, the relevance of the international context, no? And my question for you is if also your concept, your definition of science diplomacy, did you change your definition? And in the last year, you published your book in 2017, and do you think also for you, the evolution of the international context oblige you to change your ideas or a little provocative perhaps? But
No, it's
I remember very well the first time when we met in Paris, when Pascal and Leonardo organized this conference, and I suggest science diplomacy as international cooperation, techno-science cooperation, and you said, okay, but this is not science diplomacy, this is international cooperation, and we started the dialogue, for me very interesting and very positive. And,
on that point, I didn't change my view, but more generally, my understanding of science diplomacy has changed a little bit over time, which is quite normal. First, because myself, I could learn more about it. And second, because the international context also is changing and is putting forward maybe different perspectives. And I would say that maybe the main point of discussion, maybe it's a bit academic, but it would be this one. You have the mainstream, what I call the mainstream discourse on science diplomacy, which is still grounded on the idea that science diplomacy is something for improving the international order. The understanding of those words, science diplomacy, are generally those ones. If we ask an audience starting a course on science diplomacy, if you ask the audience how the word science diplomacy resonates for you, then people would mention cooperation. They will mention building bridges, etc., etc. So this is the mainstream vision of science diplomacy. But at the point of time, I could myself understand better than when science diplomacy is seen from the perspective of the states. This is another story. Science diplomacy from the perspective of the states is not for improving the world order. It's much more connected, and it's quite understandable to the national interests. I remember myself, as I was at the time a science attaché, science consular and embassies, we had every year a meeting in Paris, gathering all the science attachés of the French embassies, etc. Okay, and we had that at the end. We had the discourse of the minister himself. The minister himself came and made the discourse. He didn't say to us people in charge of science at embassies, or more broadly in charge of culture at French embassy. He didn't say, you have to cooperate more with people in the country while you are working. The discourse was not that. The discourse was, how can we be more influential? How can we more connect our actions to the competitiveness of our country, etc., etc. So, and this was, of course, science diplomacy, or more broadly, cultural diplomacy for those people in charge of the culture at our embassies. But the trend, the inspiration of the policy was exactly directed to our national interests. So the challenge in the definition of science diplomacy is that the understanding of science diplomacy generally resonates as science diplomacy for good, for global improvement, etc., etc. But the use which is made by the vocabulary of science diplomacy by the states is different. So we have to understand that, I think. And probably I was not aware of that 10 years ago. I'm more aware of that today.
Okay, thanks. Do you have any other question? Because we have some questions from our colleague. One is Caterina Monni from Irish participant, is about Antarctic, no? How can Antarctic science diplomacy break through frozen national interest in a consensus system dominated by few states?
Well, I think that when I mentioned Antarctica as a success story of science diplomacy, I mentioned that Antarctica could be kept away from national territorial ambitions. So in a way, those agreements that took place in the 90s of last year, in the 50s and 90s of last century, they could freeze the national ambitions of countries and put forward science as a protection, kind of protection against political competition between states to have their own interest in this place of the world. So up to now, I don't think I would change this statement, but there are specialists maybe here that polar regions that could have complementary different views on that.
Okay, if Rasmus want speak, we have also another remark. But here, please. Ah.
This question and my other question. Well, students first.
Ah, okay. Do you have any other question, perhaps? Because otherwise we have a remark by Alessandro Paccagnella also. He remarks that when you suggest the three visions, statalist, localist, globalist, perhaps we have also to take account of the alliance dimension, no? The existence of a military alliance has a perspective, you know. We have a USA, European Union, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, BRICS, Silk Road. What do you think about this now?
I think he's perfectly right to mention that, but this dimension is totally underplayed in the discourse on science diplomacy.
But we may take account.
We should take that into account. I think I have a rather good knowledge of the literature on science diplomacy. I read everything that comes out. This dimension of alliances, political alliances between countries in specific areas is out of the scope of the science diplomacy discourse, and which is a pity, probably. He's right.
Okay, thanks. Do you have any other question? We have the time because it's 12:30. Or now we give the floor to Professor Rasmus Bertelsen from the University of Tromsø.
Yeah, Pierre Bruno, thank you very, very much. I very much enjoyed your talk, and thank you to the other questions, very thought-provoking. So my background is I'm a political scientist. My area is international relations. And Pierre Bruno, listening to you and also listening to the questions afterwards, it really makes me think that I think it's very useful, but that's a very much, how to say, a political scientist point of view. I think it's very useful to place science diplomacy in an international relations, both theoretical and an empirical framework. But of course, there are different perspectives. So that Léonard Laborie is historian. I think, Pierre Bruno, you have an economist background. But one way is to put it in international relations framework. And there, I mean, to put it in questions of like world order and grand strategy. I mean, where it fits into, where science diplomacy fits into struggles over world order and grand strategy. When I speak later, you will hear that I'm Danish, but I also have an American research background. And in American international relations, they are very used to think about world order questions, grand strategy questions, which is natural because that's what the United States deals with. I was also thinking here that in a way, many of these discussions we have now, I mean, they place themselves in in a classical, or perhaps the classical international relations debate, which is the debate between realism and liberalism. It's the question of, is there progress in international politics? Does the world become a better place? Where the realist will say, no, the world doesn't change. International politics basically do not change because of the structure, because of anarchy, and that's unacceptable to liberals, because the fundamental premise of the whole liberal philosophical tradition is the belief in progress. There has to be progress one way or another. And I think a lot of what you say, Pierre Bruno, when you talk about the promises, of science diplomacy, I mean, to me, I hear this liberal, desperate belief in progress. There has to be progress in international politics. It cannot be just hitting each other on the head with more and more sophisticated weapons. I mean, the examples you gave, excellent examples, which I just to, how to say, address them with this framework I just used. So if we look at the US, Soviet Union, science diplomacy, Soyuz, forgot the name of the US module. But that's, of course, it's in the context of the Cold War. And the US approach to the Cold War is containment. It's Kennan's long telegram. It's a question of breaking down the Soviet Union over the long run through containment. And again, I also think, I mean, I see that very much in the Scandinavian context. I mean, we want coexistence, we want peace, we want stability. But for example, the United States does not want peace or coexistence or stability. The United States wants dominance. The United States wants complete submission from the Soviet Union, now China, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a provocative statement, but when you're talking about Soyuz and the American module, I was thinking to myself, science diplomacy could not save the Soviet Union. And what would have been the limits to science diplomacy? I mean, the United States would never have allowed any science diplomacy which would have allowed the Soviet Union socio-economically to survive, because the whole Cold War containment was about socio-economically bankrupting Soviet society, which ultimately succeeded. And then the US People's Republic of China in the 70s, and again, you said that, of course, the People's Republic of China, they needed to rebuild science and higher education after the Cultural Revolution. But if you look at it from the American side, I mean, in the Chinese Civil War, the Americans, they have a client. It's the Republic of China, it's the nationalists. That client loses, escapes to Taiwan. The United States keeps recognizing, supporting their client. That's why we still have the Taiwan issue. And then in the 70s, I mean, the United States does not accept the reality that the communist side won the Civil War. They simply need the PRC against the Soviet Union. So the United States engages the PRC for purely instrumental reasons of using the People's Republic of China against the Soviet Union. And now they don't need China against, they don't need the PRC against the Soviet Union anymore. So now they're turning back against the PRC. And about Cuba, I mean, what is the issue about US sanctions about Cuba? Well, I mean, the issue is that the United States will punish Cuba until Cuba surrenders for having resisted American imperialism in the Caribbean and in Latin America. I mean, that is the unforgivable crime of the Cubans, that they successfully resisted American imperialism. And that cannot be tolerated under the Monroe Doctrine. So science diplomacy can never go outside that. And about COVID-19, which is a fantastic question of international political economy, where I guess what we basically see is that what is most important to the West is the rent-seeking of Western pharmaceutical industry. That, of course, the West could simply have released the intellectual property rights of these vaccines. India has an enormous generic pharmaceutical capacity. If the West had said, anybody who has the capacity can produce these mRNA vaccines, and imagine the signal that would have sent from the West to the rest. But we basically showed the world that the rent-seeking of our pharmaceutical industry was most important. So yes, and I'll get to that when I speak myself. You reminded me, Pierre Bruno, I participated both in COP15 and COP21, and I sat in the plenary of COP15 when everything went to hell for the Danish government. I was working for the UN at that time, and that is the biggest train wreck I have ever witnessed. That was just unbelievable, the mess the Danish government created. But thank you very much, Pierre Bruno. This was extremely thought-provoking. And the question about the Antarctic and can science diplomacy break through national interest? Well, again, we come back to a fundamental question of international relations, which is, where do national interests come from? I mean, our national interests, are they formed by structural dynamics? So basically anarchy, competition. Do they come from like domestic, political, economic interests, etc.? Or are they rather like socially constructed? But anyway, it seems to be very, very hard to make especially great powers more cooperative. Thank you very much, Pierre Bruno. Now tell me that you strongly disagree.
I do not disagree at all, and your point is to stress that science diplomacy, any judgment that we may have on science diplomacy and effectiveness of science diplomacy cannot escape what is the context and what are the basic interests in place. I agree entirely with you. Maybe I would have a question anyway. If we want to understand why the US during the Cold War accepted scientific exchanges with the USSR and with China. With China, you made an answer that was to try to indirectly fight against USSR, to be closer to the People's Republic of China in that context. But is it enough as an explanation? Why did the US accepted the Apollo-Soyuz launching test, as they didn't learn much technically in it? Why did they accept to put forward scientific exchanges with China? And that was a suggestion by Henry Kissinger at that time to try to use this channel of science. What is your understanding of the interests of the US regarding both of those countries during the détente for improving the political exchanges and scientific exchanges within this whole set of political relations?
If you want, yes.
But there, perhaps, Pier Bueno, perhaps we return to this promise of science diplomacy. And you started your presentations with these statements about how to say science as this universal language, etc., and rationality. And when I was reading those quotes, I felt somewhat uncomfortable because I also think it very much is implicit often in that thinking that basically white men are rational and reasonable, and if just in all those irrational, unreasonable people around the world, if they learn to think like us, then they would agree with us. I think it can be an implicit premise of that approach. But there, and I mean that's been very obvious the last, especially after the end of the Cold War, these very strong Western ethnocentric assumptions that if just the others become free, they agree with us. And if you develop in a capitalist market economic direction, China, Russia, etc., they will eventually agree with us. And I remember some time ago I was rereading some statement by Bill Clinton from the late 90s about admitting China to the World Trade Organization. And Clinton basically said, when you have economic development, you have a middle class, and that eventually leads to political liberalization. And thinking back, I mean, that's an astonishing statement. He's basically telling the Chinese government, I understand your society better than you do, and I can manipulate your society under your nose. That's an unbelievable statement to make, especially about a society and a culture which is so different. So perhaps there were also these beliefs that we can make the others agree with us. And Marco, thank you also for your interesting comments. I mean, it's very, very common to, and there are very strong discourses about this democracy against autocracy division of the world. I mean, it's a classical question in international relations. It's Walz's second image of international politics. I mean, does domestic politics affect foreign policy? I basically don't think that regime nature affects foreign policy very much. But also empirically, I mean, there are twice as many voters voting in liberal democratic elections. There are twice as many voters in the BRICS than in the West, I would think. If you take India, South Africa, and Brazil together, there are probably twice as many voters in those three countries as in the West. And of course, I mean, the United States has a long and proud tradition of propping up various autocracies for various purposes. I think I recognize these, how to say, assumptions of that if just the others become more like us, they will agree with us. And I think that's a very dangerous assumption. Thank you.
Could you please repeat about the authoritarian regimes are not affected, like the fact that certain countries are not democratic doesn't affect their foreign policy? Did you assume? Okay, I would like to know better about it, but the other sorry, give me a second. because the other aspect and what's interesting about non-democracy and their scientific, because they still use science, so they just have the same language but they cannot speak certain words, which is actually true also for democracies. And what I mean by that is that we are doing scientific research, mostly on social studies, which are politically influenced, obviously, because science is politically influenced. And it's also the same thing for for authoritarian regimes. So in that aspect, I don't see much of a difference. It's not scientific diplomacy. In that aspect, can only underline the scientific fields where both countries have a similar view on what's interesting and what's not, and what's researchable and what's not. Because, for example, it can be scientific the diplomacy to study gender studies, but of course it will probably it will never happen that Italy and Iran makes an agreement on studying gender studies. So the point to that is that, again, as an instrument, science diplomacy can underline, which can something probably obvious, but at least is an empirical way of seeing this kind of relationship, or at least show them instead of let them be obvious only theoretically, on what science globally actually is. So what's in our Western country is considered scientifical, but it's not for the world in general, and what's scientifical in China and what's just politically influenced. So like, it's just to find a definition of scientific fields and scientific knowledge that can be common in the whole world, because as you said, it's not true that if certain countries were free or democratic, they would maybe study the same thing that we study. So what I mean by that is that some certain things are part of our Western culture, and we take for granted that they are influenced because we are a democracy and not by other factors, which is interesting. And it's interesting what the Western countries see as scientific, which is actually not, because diplomatically you can see that other country doesn't see certain topics as scientific or with a scientific word, or can be studied in a scientific way, which is again another maybe interesting aspect to find some truths about our view of the world and their view of the world, which is the same as you said about the IMF and China. We thought that the economy and international relations and economical cooperation between countries would have led in a certain way, just because as a Westerners we studied to reach in a way that not necessarily because we wanted it to be. Maybe it was actually what we actually think it could have happened, and we actually believe in that, which in some ways can be true, in some other maybe studies cannot. They may have be not scientifically accurate. So what can be interesting is that probably, and it's really, thank you for what you said, because it's been, as you can see, I'm really interested in what you said, and I would like to know better, because I think it's really the connection between international relations and science diplomacy, and all the questions that international relations haven't answered yet, and probably will define our study field a lot. And if only we had a question to that, it would be much easier to study international relations with at least with something to follow. For now, we have many theories, but not much answer. But it's fascinating, I think.
Okay. Do you have some remarks? Any other question?
Because what Marco brings up, I mean, the question of how to say what is tolerated. So of course, there's no academic freedom, there's no political freedom in the People's Republic of China. But you've also seen the last good year. I mean, we've seen very violent suppression of pro-Palestinian protest in American universities. I mean, you see very clearly what's not tolerated there. But Marco, you brought up the question of gender studies. And I mean, some years ago, we had this conflict between Orban's Hungary and the Central European University, I think it's called. Very noteworthy, interesting conflict about, I think, perhaps a field which has a lot more symbolic impact than perhaps other impact. So Pierre Renaud, you mentioned when you were French science counselor and you had these gatherings at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs about French cultural and science diplomacy, and you emphasized the cultural bit. So what role did values play in those discussions? Because you brought up the question of for example, gender studies. And I think, how to say, family norms, gender norms, these are really going to be sources of conflict in the future. I heard the story of a Nordic country, which in a West African country, without the consent of the host state, had established a safe house for gay activists. And I mean, you may think that very sympathetic, but I mean, it's very sympathetic, but it's diplomatically crazy. I mean, it's diplomatically crazy that an embassy does something like that without the consent of the host country. So, Pierre Renaud, in French cultural and science diplomacy, what was the role of values like that? Thank you.
This is not an easy question, but first of all, just to recall that as far as France is concerned, we think that our influence abroad should come first through culture. This is by tradition. And of course, there are also voices in the government or in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs trying to push forward the idea that France should not be only considered as a country that could be attractive through its culture, but it also could be considered attractive through its economic achievements or technological achievements or scientific achievements. But nevertheless, the trend historically is to rely a lot on cultural influence first. And then what's the link with the values? What comes to my mind is that at the time, I think it's still the case today, but at the time I was 10, 12 years ago working for our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we had those strong instructions to promote abroad what we called in French le débat d'idées. Le débat d'idées. Debate about ideas or something like that, if I try to translate it. Débat d'idées. So I was myself at that time in Russia, and the Counselor for Culture on his side and myself on my side, we had both instructions to promote débat d'idées in a country with a very difficult, it was very difficult to grasp what was the civil society. In a country where the débat d'idées was not exactly something common in Russia at that time, So I could understand that, and from a question, I understand that as a way of pushing forward in this country, in such countries, our values that we should be able to debate and to bring any kind of topic and to discuss freely any kind of topic. So that's what I can answer. I don't have knowledge about extreme example as the one you gave. But in a way, I'm not so surprised at all of that. So we want to be, I mean, we French, but I think any Minister of Foreign Affairs of any country which still thinks it has responsibility in the world, one way or another. We want to be influential, and being influential through these ways of kind of soft power is important. I think it is important. I have another question coming from what you said, Marco. Yes. Before, I'm not able to answer this question, but I would like maybe to rephrase a little bit what you said this way. Are the scientific universal values or just Western values? I'm a bit provocative in saying that. I'm not able to answer this question, but there is in the decolonial discourse, decolonial discourse, there are claims about de-Westernized science, about decolonized science, which is quite understandable. If we think about the practices of science, we can indeed look for or fight for more equity in the way science is achieved, implemented, scientific research is implemented in the North, in the South, etc. But sometimes we could understand that those claims for de-Westernized science would be a kind of criticism about the universal values of science. And I do not have the answer to that, but it's just a question. Do you have some answer? Wow.
Sorry, I'll just as an answer, possible answer, we can take for example the discipline of international relations, which was born as a totally Western idea with a totally idea of like the idealistic view of international relations, where we as Western countries, we can create a world peace, bringing everyone together. We can discuss because our ideas can be shared with others, and by sharing it, we can create world peace, and it's about how we do it, basically. Then the scientific field, the discipline of international relations, I think it got more scientific than before. So certain scientific fields, they might have born with a ideological view of the world, and then they started to become more scientific by the time, because they start to criticize itself. The ideas and theories comes out with which they westernize the scientific field, because as we know, international relations was a capitalist doctrine in a way. It was the liberal view, the American liberal view or the British liberal view, then became something else, and it became an actual discipline. So maybe the answer can be certain scientific fields have become less and they decolonialized just by abstracting and by taking off the ideological view that created the discipline, which is not a bad thing. I think that ideological views are useful if you create a new discipline. The point is that that discipline has to become something else later and try to become more objective as possible, which is hard to reach, especially in social sciences. So I think that can be like at least an example of something that, from a ideological view and a ideological scientific field, become something else by criticizing itself, which is great because it makes it more objective. I think at least this can be an answer. Partially an answer, of course.
Sure. Today, Mr. Tronfi passed this degree, I think.
No, but Pierre Bruno, I'm thinking about this. How to say, is the scientific language Western? Well, to me, it seems like, how to say, we really like this supposedly science. And of course, if we had our colleagues from science and technology studies in the room, some of our inside colleagues, they would strongly question, how to say, the rationality and objectivity, etc., of science. But to me, it seems like we really like science when it says the things we like to hear. And when we don't, if the answer is not what we want to hear, then we don't like the language anymore. So, I mean, the question of the war in Ukraine, the basic question is, why did Russia invade Ukraine? And you can formulate that, how to say, a very straightforward, hypothetic, deductive method. You can formulate two or more hypotheses. One is Russia is responding to possible NATO expansion, or an alternative hypothesis is that Russia is driven by domestic imperialist forces. I mean, these are two clear hypotheses, and then you can test those hypotheses. But of course, it's very, very evident in the Western debate that the Mearsheimer hypothesis is not tolerated. So we could, with this supposedly Western scientific language, we could easily address that question in a highly systematic way, but we don't do that because there's basically only one answer we will tolerate. Yeah, so it was just a reflection that we like the language, but only when it says what we like to hear. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have several questions. First of all, also perhaps a definition of science diplomacy. You know, we have a difference between Western countries and the other countries around the world. I don't know if they care, if they have an idea of science diplomacy. Frankly speaking, I doubt that science diplomacy is a concept useful outside, or used really outside the Western countries or countries linked to Western Europe and USA. Then another question is science. No, a colleague of mine recalled by WhatsApp that science is not democratic, in the sense that we have, but this is another discourse. No? We have diplomacy and science. Science is a real competitive field. You have different languages, different concepts about international relations, but when you want create the most big ring for neutrons in the world, like China, this is an international product of science. And then you became the leader in this science. If you want to produce use semiconductor and produce chips, you have universal language to produce these. And if your country realize these scientific goals, your country obtain leadership. I agree with the history. we have, for instance, the launch of US strategy for the leadership in technoscience at the end of the Second World War, not only nuclear, but in several other fields. This story may be useful also for today, no? And also the experience of our country, no? When we published the racial anti-Jewish Jewish laws, we left for always Enrico Fermi and other very important scientists. I think these are elements that we must to consider. And yes, I think this is also a problem for science diplomacy, because the definition of science diplomacy is not a universal definition, is linked to foreign affairs, to foreign policy. I remarked this when I studied for the first time the origins in 2010 of the discovery from US administration of science diplomacy. And now we have the experience in the Antarctic circle. In many panels, they have spoken about science diplomacy, but one relevant point was the use of technoscience for security, I think, in one end. In the other end, for me, it was very amazing. The idea that scientists, they have the truth in the pocket. Maybe too much provocative, but I am recording the session. Also, this is very dangerous. For this reason, I want to finish my panel with the image of our Italian governmental panel in Arctic Circle in order to underline that we must to have several actors around the use of science and technology in foreign policy. Last remark for me, and I think also for my colleague Alessandro Paccagnella, is that today we must convince, perhaps for another colleague in the room, we must convince our colleague interested too much to the political side of the history of international relations, European integration, the debate about this very important, very useful from an historical point of view, and also today. But today, science and technology are not cultural diplomacy, as one of my colleagues said to me in the last conference of our Italian Society for International History. He said, okay, but science diplomacy is cultural diplomacy. No, because science and technology are two relevant, the most strategic tools for leadership today in the world. I'm sorry, this is perhaps a too much realistic view, but we must to study the interconnection of science and diplomacy in foreign policy. And science diplomacy is a very nice key to open several boxes, not only the boxes of the promises, but also the boxes of the limits, potentialities, the difference between countries, between continents, the influence of several regional realities, no? Also to understand some experience like BRICS under another view. And to discover that in our newspaper, perhaps we don't speak about the most relevant international technoscience cooperation at the moment, not on the Earth, but on the space, International Space Station. International Space Station, Soviet Russia, no, Russia, Putin Russia, cooperate with Western countries, because otherwise, bang, it's very problematic. This is a reality. I don't know if it's possible for me, came back in USA, but I think that the only US officials authorized to speak with Russian are officials in charge of International Space Station. This is a reality, but, and here we say the propaganda side of the story, we don't speak about this experience. Like we don't speak also about other problem, like the debris in the space, but above all, this very nice constellation of satellites. In 5 years, they must to be burned in the atmosphere, but I may finish with Antoine Lavoisier, very nice French scientist. When he was bring to guillotine, they said to him, Antoine, don't worry, nothing may be creating, nothing may be destroyed. Also you after guillotine, which is the sense. This is satellites burn in the atmosphere, but after the metals, the components are relevant or not. And this may be another global challenges for the future. Science diplomacy may be an arena to discuss also this problem. If you have any other question or remark, not Marco, because he has exhausted us with his very interesting remarks. Thanks. Okay, we may see in the afternoon if you want or if you are obliged as students. But anyway, why I oblige the students to attending this week? Not only because we need the public. Frankly speaking, this is very stupid. But because I believe that this field is interesting and the discussion of today, I think, prove very well. But why? And this is my second point, for me, the best point. I invited some colleagues, and they are not only specialists, experts, or colleagues. We are working together since 2015, 16, 17s, thanks to Horizon Project, to other national project. I visited Svalbard with Rasmut, but this was not only tourism, this was a scientific mission. Then we came at Arctic Frontier, etc. With Pier Bruno, we exchanged several times. This is for me the very important message for students, PhD students, or postdoc. This is a work, but it's very relevant also to maintain, to stay in touch each together, to maintain a sort of team building. Also when we may disagree each other, but this is the critical analysis that we must maintain, to have a critical analysis, not to agree always with our official position, our government, European Union, or to agree with the promises of science diplomacy. Today, we proved that we want to analyze in a critical way science diplomacy. We are not the apostoli. We are not praying for science diplomacy. We are studying, we are analyzing science diplomacy. Grazie. Grazie, ci vediamo allora più tardi. Arrivederci.